That's right. You know Meg.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Derek, for agreeing to join me today on this Zoomcast, um, because I wanted to introduce the public, not just to you, but tell the story about the Big Earth Wildfire Hackathon and the work that you've been doing for many years at Stanford. So um, hopefully it'll be a good collaborative back and forth dialogue. I've got about a half a dozen questions. Um,
Sure.
and why don't we get going?
Yeah, I
So
appreciate the opportunity.
you're perfectly welcome. And I happen to be speaking with Derek Fong. Derek is the senior research engineer and lecturer at Stanford University. Derek, you and I have probably known each other, oh, maybe 2 years now. I first reached out to you. You do these wonderful series of web-based events. You call it I think you call it the Zoom-based wildfire seminar series, right?
Yeah.
You do principally for your students. And
Yeah, I guess I would say it's for the students, but also aim to reach out to the community. And you're an example of why we went from what we thought was going to be Zoom and web-based because we thought we were still in the heart of the pandemic or coming out of the pandemic, that was safer and easier. And yet what I learned was people like you, people that are interested in wildfires would like to be part of the dialogue that this seminar series is aimed at focusing on. So we decided to keep it virtual. So the last couple of years, it's safer to come out of the pandemic, but it was a convenient way to convene people, not just at Stanford, but to bring people from the local and even broader community and bring in speakers from around the world. We've had speakers from Europe as well as Canada. So without that, we couldn't afford to bring in a speaker from Europe or Canada. So we've used technology well, and through this seminar series, I've met fine people like you and others. So that's why we did it, and we sort of were fortunate that it
yeah,
came from that
I
source.
came across it, and what really impressed me was as you were saying, the breadth of the breadth of the speakers and the breadth of the topics that you were able to cover. And indeed, many of them were international or not here in California, but from other parts. And, from the comfort of my chair, I was able to educate myself and learn, and we've become friends. And since then, kind of here we are. So,
Yeah.
you're here principally today, obviously, to tell the story of the Big Earth Wildfire Hackathon. And I believe this year it starts April 3rd.
April 5th.
April
April
5th.
5th.
Okay.
Friday,
April
Friday,
5th.
April 5th.
With
Or
a
nominally April 1st if the students are taking the class, companion class associated with it. But the event itself is officially kicked off April 5th with you being our keynote speaker on Friday, April 5th. And it's going to run for 8 weeks and will culminate and finish with a project expo on Friday, May 31st.
Great, perfect. I wanted to make sure that I got that down. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to keynote because I think there's an opportunity. I had attended the poster event last year and got a chance to meet many of your teams and students. And I think for those that are interested in climate change writ large, the wildfire space is really, to coin a pun, heating up.
Yeah.
And when I say heating up, right, it's really recognized now that wildfire really cuts across the climate change spectrum, right? It's a
Yeah.
spoke in the wheel of the greater climate change challenge. But if you kind of dial in from my perspective and look at the spoke, it has everything from carbon to black carbon to PM 2.5, which obviously we now know is quite toxic for health,
Yeah.
and various facets that I think students that have an interest that also perhaps have a zen and a passion for technology. There's a broad breadth of applications that in my time at the Fire Safe Council, I've really seen come to market or at least come to early stage pilot testing that use machine learning and artificial intelligence and various other tools to really capture the full spectrum. So I hope, at least in my keynote, to convey that, we're grateful for the students that want to engage in this space. And if you're looking for a career and a pathway into climate change, the the vehicle of wildfire, I think, presents an opportunity to broadly pursue that engagement. So I'm glad to keynote, and I want to thank you for the invitation. And
Glad you accepted.
yeah, indeed. And before we really dig in, let's start with this opportunity. Tell our readers and our listeners a bit about your background, right? Who is Derek Fong? How did you wind up on this podcast with me today? But talk about your career, how you wound up at Stanford, and that's probably a good place for us to kick off.
Sure. Thanks for asking, and I'll try not to be long-winded giving you a life story, but I'll start sort of in the big picture. I'm trained as a oceanographer. I'm a physical oceanographer. I remember my aunt and uncle are asking, what is physical oceanography? It's the motions of the ocean. So that's really my background in fluid mechanics. Although I would say, going back bigger picture, my life is coming full circle. I entered Stanford as an undergrad in the 1980s, and I thought I was going to do sports medicine. And I went to a seminar in 1988 by Stephen Schneider.
Yeah.
Stephen Schneider won the Nobel Peace Prize. He gave a lecture on global warming. And I don't know if your readers or the audience of this, it depends on how old they are. In the 1980s, global warming and climate change were not a hot topic.
Right.
And yet his seminar just made an impact on me. I was trying to find my way as an undergraduate. I still was interested in sports medicine. At Stanford, to do a biological degree, you actually had to take a whole year of chemistry, which honestly was not my favorite. I did okay in it, but it wasn't my favorite.
I've heard that.
But that seminar made me realize I was really interested in our planet. And even though I didn't go on to study climate change or global warming, it made me start rethinking how could I use, I think, my strengths in math and science to improve the world. And that was through the lens of water. And so without going into my water career, I was trained as a physical oceanographer at MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic, came back to Stanford in 1998 as a postdoc, and I love Stanford. So figured out a way to keep myself there over the years as a teacher. Love lecturing. That's probably my greatest passion, being in front of the students and interacting with them, doing classical scientific research, a lot of administrative serving of accreditation, but really have a passion behind that of how can we help our planet? How can we understand our planet? So I like it for the intellectual exercise, but I think I'm also an applied scientist. I don't want to understand the world and the planet just because it's cool in equations, which it is. And I have a lot of colleagues, not to criticize their motivations, but it's not just an intellectual exercise for me. How can I understand our planet, whether it's ocean processes or now wildfires, to improve, I guess, our relationship with it? And so that's the big picture. Around 2018, I can't say that the Big Earth Hackathon is entirely my own. It is mine now. I was approached by a colleague who also is a fluid mechanics person, who's now an emeritus professor, Margot Gerritsen. She and the executive director at the time of ICME, the Institute of Computational Mathematics and Engineering at Stanford, received a small little seed fund from David Wallerstein and Tencent, saying here, can you guys think of how to incorporate big Earth data to solve problems? And Margot came to me. It was actually maybe really came to, it was just sort of a side conversation. She says, Derek, what do you think? Do you think, do you know much about hackathons, and how we could do these things? And I said, really, I don't. I know what they're about. At the time,
had you participated one?
I had not participated in one. I knew about them. In fact, again, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about today, I'm standing on the shoulders of many people that have come before me. And I think it's, if I'm given any credit, it's the ability to disseminate little pieces that I've picked up to make the Big Earth Hackathon what it is. And to give credit where it's due, there is a student-led event, and I think it's gone on probably since the mid-2010s, or maybe even earlier than that. I don't know the incarnation of it. There's something called Tree Hacks at Stanford. It's a hackathon event that is hosted entirely by students. They go out and get sponsorships from private industry, and they bring in on the order of, I don't know, 500 to 1,000 students around the US to spend a caffeine-laden 3 or 4 day weekend. So it's usually President's Day weekend. So starting on Friday night, ending on Monday, a caffeine-laden event to come up with hacks in either the hardware or software space. And as you might imagine, for those of your audience that aren't hackers, the idea of a hackathon is in a very short amount of time, can you come up with an innovative creation? The typical one for a hackathon, which there's nothing wrong with it, is profitable. Come
Yeah.
up with the next app for the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. Or maybe if you're a mechanical engineer, come up with a hardware hack, which could then be the next Kickstarter project. And many times that's what happens. These students spend a 4 day weekend and they come up with something that could jumpstart their career or at least be a side business. Anyway, sort of a little bit of a diversion to explain that, but that's what I knew about hackathons. And they were gracious enough. And I said, hey, can I observe behind the scenes what goes on? And I saw what they were doing and I said, wow, this is pretty great. Not that I wanted to replicate that, but I saw a potential there that if you could have something fun, free food, caffeine, maybe some prizes, maybe you could inspire the creativity of students. And so my angle with Margot and Karen was whether or not we could harness that amazing intellectual capital at Stanford, the Stanford students, and put them to work to solve planetary problems that they were previously unaware of. And so we did that in 2018. It was I guess the beta test was in 2018. We called it the Big Earth Hackathon. I went out and just talked to people. What kind of big Earth data do we have? So we were thinking really more from the data vantage point. And coming online, right, the 2010s, new satellite imagery. One of the main ones being Planet. It was called Planet Data. Now it's called Planet. Company that has their constellation of satellites collecting real-time
Yeah.
satellite imagery of remarkable resolution. Another company, gosh, I'm escaping the name, Satellogic. They had their own sort of spectrometry satellites. So what could you use with that kind of data that was just newly available to solve planetary problems? We did that over a caffeine-laden 3 day weekend.
There's a through line here.
Yeah.
There's a through line here, and it's caffeine, Red
It
Bull.
is caffeine.
Yes.
That's where we started. That's our roots, caffeine, and I love my coffee. But anyway, I can dive into that a little bit, but it was really successful. They had a lot of fun. I would have to say, to be honest, I had a lot of naysayers. Derek, I don't know why you're doing this. Students are going to have a lot of fun, but the projects will just sort of die after the weekend. And that seemed like a reasonable critique. We didn't have funding. I think in the ideal world, we'd had funding that would allow students to continue with the projects.
Yeah.
We didn't. So, but I said, hey, let's just give it a shot, right? We had a generous donor. Let's give it a try and see what happens. Long story short, I thought it was pretty darn good. We had over 100-something students sign up. There was attrition over the weekend. And attrition means not that people fell off, but of course, to come to a deliverable project over 38 hours, it's no small feat. But in the end, I think 30-something of those 100-something students were part of teams that delivered projects.
That's great.
Some of them were really remarkable. I'll highlight the poster child, which was our grand prize winning team. There was a team of 2 students, both undergrads, who used a combination of GIS data, GIS know-how, and planet data to come up with a model that looked at the Rohingya refugee crisis at the time. And they looked at satellite images to look at deforestation trends. And they were able to, in a matter of really 24 hours of coding, come up with a program that could track trends in migration of refugee camps and deforestation. Cool, right? not only is it cool as they use in Hollywood, this idea had legs, caught the attention of faculty at Stanford in a number of departments, medicine, humanities. Just around the start of the pandemic, this little model, they didn't get all the money. This little model was incorporated into a $10 million United Nations grant looking at human plight and how you can use technology, right, to understand human problems.
So, that's amazing, really, right? To think that, at the end of the day, you're contributing and supporting students that, ultimately you don't know where things end up, right?
You don't. So that's the risk. Will the students come, and what will they come up with? So the good news is I've done now, gosh, 5 of these. They come and they do some things that I would never imagine, and that's the idea. So I should back up. I think I forgot to give one little blurb, which I think is really important.
Sure.
The vision of Big Earth Hackathon is to bring really smart Stanford students with no preconceived notions of problems that are of interest to the world, maybe faculty, industry, government officials, and have them innovate. So they're not encumbered by historical understanding.
That's
So they
that's
may
an
have.
interesting approach. I think that's because I've been involved or part of other hackathons, and you come to iterate on an idea. It's already kind of pre-prescribed. We want to get at this solution or tackle this problem, but you're really asking your students to come in kind of with a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and really get that spark of innovation and creativity, in the spur of the moment.
That's right. So that is you have spoken generally about what the aim is. Blank mind, but incredibly smart mind, right? Be creative and think outside the box. And in fact, I have something in my scorecard for the judges. Maybe there is no box. Right? It's just something funny about it. Maybe there is no box. So think outside the box, but maybe there is no box, and be that creative. So I'm not going to spend too much on the history. Fast forward after that, I thought, wow, that was really cool. I'm an oceanographer. I think the next one, if we can do one, should be on water. We did one on water. But one thing I decided was like that while it was successful, I thought students were rushing, right? Of course they're rushing, right? Ours was only a 3-day as opposed to a 4-day event. They had basically 32 hours or something to do something. What if you gave students more time? And I knew that carried a risk, a known risk, or I shouldn't say a risk, a known cost. I'm not going to see 120 students working on things because
There'll be attrition.
They have got classes, they've got other activities.
Yeah.
But what if I aimed at quality over quantity? And Margot and I, at the time, she said, okay, you're leading this, Derek, you're directing it, your call. I'll go with it. I think there is a risk, but you're right, it might reap benefits. And so the idea was, okay, what if we made it an 8-week? Why would we make it a quarter-long event at Stanford? Stanford's a 10-week quarter. We won't make it quite 10 weeks because we want this to wrap up before finals week.
Sure.
We'll get less people signing up for the event, but maybe we'll end up with one, more mature products. That's the ultimate goal. But that would be based on, hopefully, not only just having more mature products, the more mature products will be the result of students having more time to think about the problems at hand. We did it. It worked. It worked. We had, less. We still had the same number of students almost sign up at the time, maybe a little bit less, maybe 80 or 90. But the projects that came out of it were mature. And I won't go through all the projects, but again, many of those projects had legs. They were utility. So the Kodaga Center, which is Stanford's state-of-the-art water treatment research facility, they had a dashboard that was developed for it that they still use. So things like that came from the project. Someone did just get sort of a Kickstarter project that was then funded. Another project became part of a Department of Energy proposal through a faculty member at the law school that funded 3 PhDs. So, the example, another
Never
example of
know.
how the results didn't have to just end at the end of the hackathon.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't really kind of think in that format before, but having attended last year's hackathon, right? I think the opportunity to iterate over time, right? Because most of the hackathons I've either attended, um, um, judged in, right? They are over a weekend, a couple of days. It's kind of the Big Bang Theory. In here, you give the chance of the students to iterate on their idea, think it through, maybe pivot, come up
Mhm.
with those aha moments that, often, don't emerge in a 24/72 kind of hour environment, right? So I think that's really
Yeah,
interesting. And they get to cross pollinate across the Stanford ecosystem,
yeah.
which, I'm sure there's a lot of advantages to that. So, I think that's really interesting. And I think, what you were able to cover in that arc really was the bit of the history of the wildfire challenge and how it got started and how many you did. And so, let's dial in a little bit more specific because, we're now talking about wildfire, right?
Absolutely.
And
I
and
was about to get to it.
I
Sorry I took
have
too
no
long on
doubt you
water and big
were.
earth data.
I,
Yeah, sorry about that.
great, no, great minds think alike, right? And so why wildfire, right? Why did you choose this topic, and how do you see wildfire in your view fitting in, into climate change writ large, and why the focus on wildland fire specifically?
Well, I'll just say I was naive, or not naive, at least I was aware. After those 2 successful hackathons, question was, what's the next topic?
Hmm.
Water is still relevant, but we thought about food and energy. This is right before Margot retired. We said, this is 2018, 2019. So we had seen, as Californians, big events, right?
Yes.
Fire in Santa Rosa, just the fires, the intense fires in California in 2017 and 2018 were in the back of our minds. And we said, what about wildfires? We don't know much about it. I mean, we're fluid mechanicians and oceanographers, but fires have to be important. It's sort of funny. We're sitting at Coupa Cafe and said, before we decide, let's both do homework over the next week and meet again. Let's talk to people, see if people agree that this is a relevant topic. We didn't have to come back a week later. I made a few emails, made a few phone calls. People were like, please
Sure.
do a hackathon on wildfires. There is such a need. So,
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because happenstance, I don't want to say luck because that's not the appropriate word, but that was really the first exposure to what we now kind of call the mega fires here in California, right?
yeah, the
Where
cluster of megafires,
cluster,
absolutely.
the lightning complex fires, the LNU and the other complex fires that hit that year really kept it top of mind, right? So it was omnipresent, and I think perhaps right that timing of that really could be a genesis of why wildfire to some degree, right?
Absolutely. For me, like I said, I came in, I'm not a fire guy. I'm an oceanographer. And the joke for a couple of years was like, I'm a fish out of water, right? But I just, but I saw
But
that this
bump.
was, yeah, I saw this was an important problem. And the more I talked to try to frame what I needed to make this a successful event, the more I realized that this is a problem that really needs a lot of attention. You asked the question, is it related to climate change? Absolutely. And it's doesn't mean that flooding and sea level rise aren't important climate change issues, but this is a local one and a very complicated one. And I guess one thing I didn't mention that has always been in the back of my mind for the Big Earth Hackathon is planet problems aren't just engineering and science problems. I mean, I'm an engineer and scientist,
Yeah.
so no lack of respect for my brethren, but there are a lot of planetary problems that go beyond basic science or basic earth science. They require insights from law, education, medicine, social sciences. And as I dug deeper into the wildland fire problem, it became clear to me that it was the poster child for a planetary problem, right? Because, in fact, I'm teaching a class right now on wildfire policy related to wildfires. We aren't going to engineer and science ourselves out of climate change, let alone the wildfire problem. The
100%.
wildfire problem is, yes, it's due to climate change. Climate change has increased the frequency and intensity of these wildfire events, not just in California, right?
Globally,
Around the world, right?
globally.
Chile, Canada, and well, Maui's, another state, but Maui got it. Greece, it goes Portugal, Australia, it
Absolutely.
goes on.
It knows no boundary.
It knows no boundaries. And yet, I would argue that if we only solve the science and engineering problem, we're not going to solve the wildfire problem because it involves social sciences, namely human behavior, politics, issues of injustice and inequities in our society. You mentioned PM 2.5. There are medical issues associated with it.
Yeah.
There are policy issues associated with it. So why wildfires? Because it has all the elements of what I originally envisioned with Margot as a planet problem that doesn't need the traditional research grant, solve this scientific problem,
Sure.
or an engineered solution. It requires an all hands on deck approach. And the reason why I'm passionate and why this is actually going to be the fourth Wildland Fire Challenge this year, we haven't gone back to water, we haven't gone to energy and food, and those are by all means important.
Absolutely.
Wildfires are at the forefront, and it's such a complicated, multifaceted problem that we need all hands on deck. So the more creative solutions I get each year, we can start making little dents into this problem that needs a solution yesterday.
Boy, I'd like to bottle that answer because, in some respects, that's kind of what drew me to my interest in wildfire, right? I don't have a background in fluid mechanics. I never served in the fire service. Right? I grew up mostly on the East Coast where I can't ever remember. Well, I certainly was never evacuated. We certainly, in my time there, never had a smoke day. We never had orange skies. I moved to California 27 years ago, and I've seen the arc of change, right? And for me, you really hit on something that resonates with me because why I'm interested because wildfire really sits at the intersection of all these other issues, and wildfire, like most, if not all, climate issues, there's no single silver bullet that if we just did this, presto, problem solved.
Yes. Yes.
Right? It is such an interlocking challenge across so many issues, as you said, from policy to social and economic justice, to biodiversity, to construction, housing, and planning, right? It
Yes.
crosses every imaginable sector. And I hope that's one of the things that I want to try to instill when I talk to your students is, just because you're doing this in the hackathon, step back and understand wildfire broadly, because there is a place for you to engage. You don't have to be a machine learning C++ developer, right? You could bring your thoughts and ideas into so many areas where they're needed, right?
Yes.
That it can provide such an engaging career. So, I think that's, fantastic. And we can spend, another episode just talking about this challenge in general.
Yeah.
So
I could talk about it all day, honestly.
yeah, me too. But I have to work, and I know you have classes to tend to. So let me just ask you this, and we touched on it, but what do you hope for your students to get out of it and take away from this year's hackathon? Why should they consider participating if they hear about it, see it, whether it's on social media, whether they pick it up some other way? Why should they engage?
I think for two reasons. One, if they've been in California, I mean, we've been blessed the last couple of years, honestly. But if they're watching the news, they'll be aware that wildfires are a hot topic. No pun intended. But I'm guessing most people, because they probably came from the same vantage point as me. I'm a native California. There were wildfires when I grew up in the Bay Area. I mean, in the Sierras. I love backpacking camping. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, bummer, we can't go backpacking or the air is horrible. But I think without being exposed to it, you don't understand how complicated a problem this is and how you can contribute, whether you're an engineer, a scientist, a social scientist, a medical student, the list goes on. And so I hope that students participating would realize that planetary problems such as this one require an intersection between the humanities and science and engineering. And I think that that's really the sell of why this is important. From an educational perspective, I think this hackathon, and actually I offer it as a companion class. Students don't have to take the class, but they can take a class for credit to get some units and credit in participating. Whether they participate as an extracurricular or as a class, this is a unique opportunity to do something practical. Most of our classes at Stanford, I think, I teach classes, so I'm not going to badmouth the stuff I teach. We teach students basic skills, basic understandings, theories that will equip them well in their careers, right? Their foundational work. But rarely, there are a few other exceptions, rarely do they really do something hands-on. They really get their hands dirty and do something that is of first-hand practical significance
In an applied way, right? In an
in an applied
applied
way,
kind of way.
in an applied way. And so what I do know, having done this enough, is students take this class or participate, they will end up contributing something to the world. And it's not hyperbole. Typical projects really have an impact from this happen, whether they have legs and continue or not.
Sure.
Students can really come up with an innovation that is meaningful. To see that the classes they took, the little smattering of class and background that they have, they're different backgrounds, whether they're an engineering student or a social science student or a law student, they actually have the skills to right now, when they take the class, to make a meaningful impact on the world. And so this is what we call project-based learning. We're trying to do that more at Stanford, but rarely do students do much project-based learning. But this is project-based learning. And not only is it a project, right? These are real projects. These are not intellectual exercises. These are real, tangible problems that I'm hoping they will come up with meaningful solutions or prototypes of solutions. And so I think that's rewarding. The students that have participated have told me that. Very flattering, right? Maybe the best class they took at Stanford because it was not a typical class.
Yeah, and I think what's unique that I've seen about the way that you've approached it, and you just touched on it, right? The students are interdisciplinary, right? They come maybe from a legal background. They're not just coders developing, a Python or C++ system, right? And they come from those different backgrounds that, from my experience, right, managing staff, managing teams, digging in on projects, that's where you get that creative spark. Because, those that don't come from that discipline have the perspective of looking from a different lens and can often help drive those that have the deeper systems knowledge to say, I didn't think of it in that way, or I didn't picture it like that. So it's really, I think, that creativity that when I came and saw the various projects that were proposed in the posters last year, it was really amazing. And I had brought my then 18-year-old, 17-year-old, who now is about to finish his first year in physics at RPI, Rensselaer Polytech. And on the ride home, he said, Dad, I had no idea that there were so many different things related to wildfire, right? I just thought it was, these large fires and forest management and firefighters. And, it really opened his eyes to kind of the depth of what you're able to bring, which kind of maybe is a good segue into the next topic. So, in looking at this year's hackathon, I noticed that you've got a real broad array of, focuses or project areas, right? Kind of a big suite of things that people can, and teams and students can dig into. Just share with me a little bit of the thinking about that. How did you come up with some of those focus areas or challenges, as you call them? And because it's quite comprehensive.
Well, thank you. That's very flattering, both to hear your son's feedback and also that you think it's comprehensive. So yeah, if you look at our website, um, I've described the challenge as having three focus areas, although I would argue I didn't need to say them. I think it goes without saying, wildfires covers a huge space, but I wanted to maybe inspire students to think about what would categorize potential solutions to this huge problem of wildfire. So one, obvious, mitigation. How do we reduce the risk of wildfires? Or if there's a fire, how do we mitigate or reduce the risk or loss of human life, even if a fire is happening? So that's an obvious one. I think the obvious one for engineers and scientists is like, can we predict? Can we predict when or where wildfires might or might not happen? Um, can we analyze data? Right? I said the roots of the Big Earth Hackathon was in Big Earth data, and many of the projects coming from this will work with data. And yet I've opened my eyes and ears, honestly. I've grown a lot. I was an oceanographer. Now I guess I'm now really a wildfire scientist or practitioner. But it's not just an engineering and science problem, right? There are equity and fairness issues. And so I highlight equity and fairness as one of the three pillars or focus areas, because you can't have accurate predictions or analysis or mitigation without really thinking about how fires disproportionately affect different populations and in different ways.
Absolutely. And let me just add to that. And this isn't necessarily a planned plug for Stanford's research, but the interdisciplinary team that the Bill Lane Center has and Stanford has, Stanford, broadly speaking, has done some of the most interesting research about those inequities lately. How wildfire smoke affects communities of color differently than it does other communities. The lack of adequate health care to address um, immediate issues on high smoke days and high heat days. So I do want to give a shout out, because I try to take in as much of the research that Stanford publishes, and you really dialed in on all facets, but particularly the inequities surrounding wildfire smoke, of which we're just really scratching the surface of what they are in terms of how they're developing. So kind of a quick plug for those
No,
that are
it's
interested in this.
very,
Go to
very
Stanford.
worthwhile.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important to give that plug, because not to plug the Stanford scientists, but the equity and fairness issue is something most people aren't aware of. Not for lack of trying, it's just people aren't aware of them. So we need to publicize and inform people that these aren't, again, simple issues related to wildfires. Wildfires are not simple themselves, but when you start thinking about the interactions with the human sphere, it gets 10 layers more complicated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Derek, as we look to kind of wrap up our talk here today, um, what else should the listeners or readers, when we transcribe this, know about this year's contest? Can they participate? Can they attend any of the activities? Share a little bit of light on those
Sure.
people that may be listening or reading that aren't in the Stanford ecosystem or community.
So the big shout out I'll give or ask is, if you have a project idea, send it my way. So the recording, if not, it's dfong, D-F-O-N-G at stanford.edu. I post potential projects onto the website for our students. Those are projects that students might adopt, might not adopt, or create from an amalgamation of them their own. So I always believe in crowdsourcing, because I don't know all the relevant problems out there. I try to talk to as many people as possible. And if someone can bring forward a tangible project that they think is important, they may have the data or some insights to bring into play, please bring my attention to it. Second way to participate, if you end up offering a project and a student team likes it and actually adopts and pursues it, I hope your reader or audience will consider being a mentor for that team, or at least a stakeholder that can provide feedback over the course of 8 weeks of whether they are on track to addressing the right thing, or have they taken a detour and actually missed the point. And then finally, these are public events. We have a couple public events. Your keynote address on Friday, April 5th, it'll be published on Stanford Events. It's at 2 p.m., I believe, the keynote address.
Yeah.
That's open to the public. The location is to be determined. It's almost ironed out, but it'll be there. So those are public events. So you want to hear Seth speak? By all means. A more tangible way to really experience what Seth talked about, come to our project expo. Students stand by a poster highlighting what they did over the course of the quarter. That's on Friday, May 31st in the afternoon. That will again be open to public. It'll be advertised on Stanford events. Seth can probably provide extra details in the newsletter, et cetera,
We
as we
will.
get closer. But those are the ways to, if you really are interested in just seeing what the students do, come to the events. But if you are in the wildfire space yourself, I would love to hear from you and how maybe students can actually help you out, because we've got some remarkably talented students at Stanford, and we just got to expose them to the problems and then turn them loose.
Well, look, I appreciate that. And maybe lastly, are there opportunities for philanthropic or corporate support or ways that
Thank you for asking. Absolutely. So this is very much a grassroots effort that honestly I put on my back to try to keep going. If we had more money, I think this could be bigger. So any small contribution to our cause, and if you've liked what you've heard from me and want to learn more and think it's worthwhile, no contribution is too small. We definitely need financial help to keep this thing afloat. It's remarkably expensive to even put something like this together, but I think it's worthwhile. And I think the return on investment is huge. And I'm hoping that this will grow in the years. I'm trying to get the Stanford administration to see the value. They do see it, but I'm hoping we can get some external partners to really make this a reality and something we can perpetuate long into the future.
Well, certainly, I could speak for the board of the Santa Clara County Fire Safe Council. We're happy to be involved. And if we could help bring some of those collaborations and funding partnerships together, we want to do that because, obviously Stanford is in our backyard, but more importantly, it's the reason why we exist as an organization too. So, Derek Fong, I want to thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I myself look forward to seeing you on April 5th. And of course, we'll talk beforehand and thank you for making yourself available today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and it's great collaborating with you, and I appreciate our friendship that we've developed to many more years.
You got it.